Well, do you want to start by talking about technology?
Yes.
Sure. So, necessity is the mother of invention. We're all familiar with that, and it's all totally true. But first, you have to have the necessity. So we've been living in this wonderful moment going back to roughly 1945 when everything has been available on a global scale at global economies of scale. And that is what allowed, for example, the Germans to import all this natural gas from the Russian space and then play around with the green transition, even though they're not a windy or a sunny country. They tend to they flat out lie about their statistics. They only get about 9% of their electricity from green tech. They get more from lignite than they do from coal, more from coal from everything else combined, that's remaining.
Wow.
And so now they're
Still,
going back
still
to,
in
oh my,
2020.
oh yeah. No, they've spent a huge amount of money and they've tested the technology to the limits. And for the rest of us to benefit from that, that has been great. But it's just wildly inappropriate technology for where they live. So in order to innovate past this, now that we're actually having the crisis, and now that their Enron style accounting methods for their carbon emissions are being laid to bear, they can start the innovation process. But we know that wind and solar cannot be part of that because it's not a windy and sunny country. And we know that natural gas can't really be a part of that because it would have to be shipped in from a different continent. And it takes 3 to 8 years for a new field to come online, much less the supporting infrastructure. So their choices are very simply in the short term, nuclear, coal, and lignite.
What is
Uh,
lignite? I'm sorry, I don't know what lignite
Lignite
is.
is a soft, wet form of brown coal that is 20% water by weight. It is the dirtiest of the fuels, and it is Germany's primary fuel source. Has been for 15 years, ever since they started the energy transition. Honestly, it's not just cobalt. There's a whole variety of materials. I'm oversimplifying here a little bit, but if you have a thermal power plant or a conventional internal combustion engine vehicle, basically you're lighting a match, burning something, capturing the heat, and that's what makes conventional fossil fuels work. You don't need a lot of materials aside from the fuel itself, obviously, to make that happen. But if you want to electrify, then you need a very different system for the motor and the turbine and the axles even. And at the end of the day, you also then are moving stuff. And when you are moving stuff with electricity, it requires a lot more energy. An electric water heater, as a rule, is going to require a lot more power than a natural gas fired one. And so you have to also make the product lighter. And so you need an order of magnitude more materials than what you need for a conventional vehicle. And you need an order of magnitude different materials. You don't just need steel. You need steel and aluminum and silicon and cobalt and lithium and copper and zinc and all the rest. One of the We are discovering right now that we cannot have globally available fossil fuels at a reasonable price without the Russians. But there's
That's
no
it.
way
We
in
would
hell we can do the green transition without them, because they're a top three producer for most of the materials that we're going to need. We are
without
not going green with today's technology at scale. Now, there are specific geographies. I mean, the whole point of the book is that geography really does matter.
yes.
And there are places today where the green transition at scale makes sense. Places where the solar intensity is high and reliable and the wind intensity is high and reliable. And if you are in those zones, then the technologies we have today can work. What we're seeing right now within the green community is this delightful conversation, primarily between the California Greens and the German Greens, because we have very similar policies in both places in terms of encouraging green tech to be put on the grid in mass. Now, the Germans have spent 3 times as much as the Californians have, but the Californians get 10 times as much electricity because the sun shines in California.
Right.
And so they're having this debate and this conversation. It's very quizzical about why in one place is it working broadly, because, it's still California, and why in the other place is it leading to complete deindustrialization? Well, and the answer is basic geography. They should have had this conversation 15 years ago. But now that we're coming up against this wall of absolute shortages in all the materials that are needed, the green community is coming to the belated conclusion that they're going to have to choose where to do this, where it will actually work. And if you put up solar panels and wind turbines in Germany, as a rule, you're drastically increasing your carbon footprint. Whereas if you put them in California, you're actually doing what happened. Now, it's turning into a knife fight because the blind ideologues refuse to admit that basic geography maybe has a role in this conversation. But we're finally having that conversation. firm up the green position within the Democratic coalition because we're going through a political reshuffling in the United States. But the Biden administration also has two other advantages. Number one, countries like Germany have worked out a lot of the kinks in the technology, so it's much better than it was 20 years ago. So there's a low-hanging fruit argument. And then second, you've got the Great Plains in the United States. You've got the Southwest in the United States. You have some very good green tech zones. So you can apply this stuff at scale and have it actually make sense. Now, if you're putting up solar in New York, you're an idiot.
Yeah.
And luckily, there's not a lot of that going on. But the Northeast, as a rule, and this is a gross over exaggeration, tends to set standards that can't be met in the United States for their fuels, and then they just import them. And since the stuff is produced somewhere else, it doesn't count against their carbon content. It should be part of the solution. I agree. It's carbon free. There's a waste issue for disposal that has not been solved, and it doesn't look like it's going to be solved anytime soon. I would argue there the issue is time. Like if we know we have an energy crisis today and we decide we want to do a power plant build out in order to fix some of this stuff, assuming that there was not a single regulation that had to be met and we could start shoveling in the ground today, you're not going to get first power from those plants in 7 years. We just don't have that kind of time. Well, there's a much broader change going on here than just the green transition. We're looking at a breakdown of the entire globalized structure. Part of this is strategic. The Americans created globalization basically as a bribe to convince everyone to be on our side during the Cold War, and it worked.
Right.
But 1992, the Cold War ended, and we've been edging away ever since. And then second, population structures have evolved. It used to be everyone lived on a farm. But as the world globalized, it also industrialized and urbanized. And as people moved off the farm and into the cities to take manufacturing jobs, they went from living on 40 acres with a pig to living in a condo with a Shih Tzu. Yeah. And they went from kids being free labor to being very expensive habits. And so we went from having 7 kids to 1.2. You play that forward 75 years, and it's not that the world is running out of children. That happened 30 years ago. We're now on the edge of running out of working age adults. And without adults, you don't get the production, you don't get the consumption that is the basis of international trade. So we're in this environment now where we've had a really good run that demographically speaking was just a brief moment in time, and now we've aged out. Yeah, and in that sort of environment, demand for products drops. And you remove the Americans from providing the security environment that allows very, very slow-moving super tankers to just inch their way around the world.